The weight of one shot. The stench of diesel exhaust and rotting vegetation hung heavy in the January air as the transport truck wheezed to a halt outside Camp O'Donnell. Private First Class Thomas Whitefeather Morrison clutched his Springfield M1903A4 closer as Filipino guards shouted orders in broken English. The rifle felt like an anchor to his former life, back when Staff Sergeant Kowalski had called it Grandpa's deer rifle, and Lieutenant Hayes had questioned its worth in modern warfare. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been only 3 weeks since San Miguel. "Everyone out! Move!" Morrison stumbled from the truck bed with 42 other captured Americans, all remnants of units scattered across Luzon during the Japanese advance toward Manila. His Cherokee grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "A rifle is only as good as the man behind it." Here in the humid chaos of Bataan Peninsula's aftermath, surrounded by concrete barracks and guard towers, that wisdom felt hollow. The camp commandant, a thin Japanese officer with wire-rimmed glasses, stood reviewing documents at a wooden table. Morrison noticed the man's careful attention to detail, the way he arranged papers in precise stacks. Nothing like the screaming fanatics from the training films back at Camp Pendleton. "Name and unit?" Morrison stepped forward, his M1903A4 still slung across his shoulder. The commandant looked up, studying the weathered rifle with what appeared to be professional curiosity rather than contempt. "Marine Sniper, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines." The officer made notes in careful English. Then, unexpectedly, he gestured toward Morrison's rifle. "This weapon. You used it in combat?" Morrison hesitated. The question felt like a trap, but the officer's tone carried genuine interest. Around them, other prisoners shuffled through processing, guards checking identification and equipment. The tropical heat pressed down on everything, making uniforms stick to skin and turning the red clay soil into a sticky paste. "Yes, sir." "Effective range?" The conversation felt surreal. Morrison had expected interrogation, perhaps worse. Instead, this felt almost like a technical discussion between professionals. He thought of Captain Tanaka, 430 yards away through his weaver scope, consulting a map in those final moments before everything changed. 800 yards, more with favorable conditions. The commandant nodded thoughtfully and made another note. Then he looked directly at Morrison, and for just a moment, the young Marine saw something unexpected. Fatigue. Not cruelty or hatred, just the bone-deep weariness of a man doing a job far from home. "You will retain your weapon for now. Report to Barracks 7. Morrison blinked in surprise. Other prisoners had surrendered their equipment immediately. Why was he different? "Sir, you are a marksman. We may have use for such skills." As Morrison walked toward the indicated barracks, rifle still on his shoulder, he felt the weight of contradictions pressing down harder than the Philippine heat. Everything he'd been taught suggested that holding onto his weapon in enemy hands meant certain execution. Yet here he was, still armed, still breathing, carrying the very rifle that had shattered a Japanese assault and saved 412 Filipino civilians. The barracks smelled of sweat, fear, and disinfectant. 43 men crowded into a space meant for 25. Morrison found a corner and carefully placed his M1903A4 against the wall, the weaver scope reflecting the harsh electric light. "What the hell, Morrison?" Corporal Danny O'Brien from the 3rd Battalion sat on the nearest bunk, staring at the rifle in disbelief. "Why'd they let you keep that thing?" Morrison didn't have an answer. In training, they'd learned that Japanese forces executed snipers on sight, viewing them as dishonorable assassins rather than legitimate combatants. Yet the commandant had not only spared his life, but allowed him to retain the very symbol of his effectiveness. "I don't know, Danny. I honestly don't know." Outside the barracks windows, the sun set over Luzon Island, painting the guard towers black against an orange sky. Morrison touched the leather sling of his grandfather's rifle and wondered what other assumptions about this war might prove wrong. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. The morning bugle echoed across Camp O'Donnell at 0530 hours, jerking Morrison from dreams of Oklahoma deer hunts with his Cherokee grandfather. Around him, 42 other Americans struggled to consciousness in the stifling barracks air. The tropical humidity made everything damp. Uniforms, blankets, even the concrete walls seemed to sweat. "Roll call in 10 minutes. Sergeant Matsumoto, a guard who spoke reasonable English, appeared in the doorway. Morrison noticed the man's boots were worn nearly through, his uniform carefully patched, not the image of overwhelming Japanese military might from the propaganda reels. During the scramble to formation, Morrison kept his M1903A4 close. 3 days in camp, and no one had yet explained why he alone among the prisoners retained his weapon. The other men shot him worried glances, some jealous, others concerned that his special status might bring collective punishment. The commandant appeared for morning inspection, the same careful attention to detail Morrison had noted on arrival. As the officer moved down the ragged line of prisoners, he paused before Morrison. "You will report to the camp perimeter after breakfast. Bring your rifle." "Yes, sir." The breakfast was rice porridge with small pieces of fish, more substantial than Morrison had expected. Corporal O'Brien leaned close as they ate. "Danny, what do you think they want?" "Nothing good, Morrison. Snipers don't get special treatment. Maybe they're planning something for the other prisoners and need you to—" O'Brien didn't finish the sentence, but Morrison understood. The fear that he might be turned against his own men had haunted him for 3 sleepless nights, yet something about the commandant's manner suggested a different purpose. After breakfast, Morrison reported to the designated coordinates along the camp's eastern perimeter. The jungle, pressed close to the fence line here, dense green vegetation that could hide anything. Sergeant Matsumoto waited with the commandant, and a Japanese soldier Morrison hadn't seen before, younger, with the alert posture of an experienced marksman. "This is Corporal Yamamoto," the commandant explained. Is a sniper with the 16th Division." The young Japanese soldier bowed slightly, then gestured toward Morrison's rifle with unmistakable professional interest. Morrison found himself in the strange position of discussing rifle mechanics with an enemy sniper while Filipino birds called from the jungle canopy overhead. Yamamoto spoke rapid Japanese to the commandant, who translated, "He wishes to understand your scope adjustment technique, wind compensation at extended range." Morrison hesitated. Sharing tactical knowledge with the enemy violated every regulation he'd learned. Yet something about the moment felt less like interrogation and more like 2 craftsmen comparing techniques. The morning heat was already building, creating the shimmer effects he'd learned to read during those crucial moments at San Miguel. "Tell him it depends on humidity and heat differential. The morning thermals rise differently here than in temperate climates." As the translation proceeded, Morrison watched Yamamoto's face. The Japanese soldier nodded with understanding, then pointed to his own rifle, a Type 97 with a surprisingly sophisticated scope. Through careful gestures and the commandant's translation, a technical conversation emerged. What struck Morrison most was the humanity of it. Yamamoto spoke of his training in Hokkaido, where mountain conditions created challenges similar to those Morrison had faced in the Ozark Hills. Both men had learned to read wind patterns, to calculate for gravity drop, to control breathing in those final, crucial seconds. The conversation lasted an hour. As it concluded, the commandant looked thoughtful. "You will return tomorrow at the same time. Corporal Yamamoto believes there is much you both can learn." Walking back to the barracks, Morrison felt a strange disorientation. Nothing in his training had prepared him for professional respect from an enemy sniper or for a camp commandant who facilitated technical discussions rather than demanding intelligence. The weight of his grandfather's rifle seemed different now, not just a weapon, but a bridge to understanding that transcended nationality. O'Brien was waiting when he returned. "Well, they wanted to talk shop, rifle techniques, scope adjustments." Nothing classified. That's it? Morrison nodded, but privately he wondered if anything was ever truly just that simple in war. How does a soldier hold on to enemy doctrine when the enemy treats him as a fellow professional rather than a monster? The letter arrived on Morrison's 10th day in Camp O'Donnell, delivered by Sergeant Matsumoto during the afternoon work detail. Morrison was helping repair damaged sections of the camp fence under the Philippine sun, his M1903A4 leaning against a nearby guard tower, still inexplicably in his possession. "For you, Morrison, son." The envelope bore his mother's careful handwriting and a postmark from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, dated 6 weeks earlier. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, aware that Matsumoto waited nearby, not from suspicion but from what seemed like genuine concern. "Dearest Tommy, we got word from the War Department that you're missing in action somewhere in the Philippines. Your father says not to worry, that Cherokee don't die easy, but I can't help myself. Mrs. Henderson's boy came home from Pearl Harbor and says the Japanese are inhuman monsters who eat their own dead. The radio keeps talking about how they torture prisoners and don't follow the rules of war. I pray every night that if you're captured you find a way to escape or that our boys rescue you soon. Everyone in town is saying we need to finish off every last one of them for what they did to our ships. Stay strong, son. Remember what grandfather taught you about reading the land and the wind, and remember you're fighting for everything decent in this world against people who don't understand mercy. All my love, Mama." Morrison folded the letter carefully, his throat tight. Around him, the work detail continued. Americans and Filipino prisoners reinforcing fence posts, while Japanese guards supervised with varying degrees of attention. The tropical air hung thick with humidity and the scent of flowering vines that climbed the perimeter wire. "Bad news from home?" Matsumoto asked in his careful English. Morrison looked up, startled by the question. "My mother, she's worried. Mothers worry is natural." The simple humanity of the response caught Morrison off guard. He thought of the daily conversations with Corporal Yamamoto, who had shown him photos of his own family in Kyoto, a wife and infant daughter he hadn't seen in 18 months. Yesterday, Yamamoto had shared rice candy from a care package, the sweet dissolving on Morrison's tongue like a memory of childhood. That evening in the barracks, Morrison sat on his bunk cleaning his rifle while O'Brien read over his shoulder. "Your mum's right, you know, about what they are." Morrison looked up from his bore brush. "What who are?" "The Japs, Morrison. Don't tell me you're falling for their act." Several other prisoners gathered around, their faces showing the strain of captivity and uncertainty. Morrison felt the weight of their expectations, their need for him to confirm the narratives that made sense of their suffering. Matsumoto asked about my mother's letter, seemed concerned. "Jesus Christ, Morrison, they're playing you. Next thing you know, they'll want intelligence about unit positions or supply routes." Morrison wanted to argue, but how could he explain? How could he describe the careful respect Yamamoto showed for his rifle, or the way the commandant ensured prisoners received adequate medical attention, or the fact that camp conditions, while Spartan, were far from the torture chambers described in training films? Maybe they're just different than we expected. The silence that followed felt dangerous. O'Brien stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Morrison, they bombed Pearl Harbor. They're killing American boys all across the Pacific, and you're sitting here polishing your rifle talking about how different they are. Danny, I'm just saying, you're saying nothing, because there's nothing to say. Don't let them turn you into a collaborator." Later that night, as Morrison lay awake listening to the humid darkness, he reread his mother's letter by moonlight filtering through the barracks windows. Every word reinforced everything he'd been taught about Japanese brutality and American righteousness. Yet every day brought new contradictions. Yamamoto's quiet professionalism, Matsumoto's small kindnesses, the commandant's attention to prisoner welfare. Outside the windows, night sounds drifted from the Philippine jungle. Insects, distant birds, the soft conversations of guards who missed their families as much as any American prisoner. Morrison touched his grandfather's rifle and wondered how long a man could carry two conflicting truths without something breaking. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The malaria outbreak began during Morrison's third week at Camp O'Donnell, when the afternoon rains turned the compound into a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Red Cross observer who had arrived the previous week, moved through the barracks with quiet efficiency, her medical bag containing precious quinine and sulfur drugs. Morrison first saw her as he returned from his daily session with Corporal Yamamoto, where they had been comparing marksmanship techniques using improvised targets at the rifle range. His M1903A4 performed flawlessly despite the humid conditions, and Yamamoto had shared adjustments for tropical climate shooting that Morrison filed away with professional interest. "You're the sniper," Dr. Chen said, approaching Morrison near the barracks entrance. "The one they let keep his rifle." "Yes, ma'am. Private First Class Morrison." She was Chinese-American, perhaps 30, with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen enough suffering to develop effective emotional armor. Her presence in the camp represented the strange neutrality of the Red Cross, neither American nor Japanese, but something apart from the war itself. "I've been watching your interactions with the guards. It's unusual." Morrison felt defensive. "I follow orders, Doctor, same as anyone. I'm not criticizing. I'm observing. Yesterday I saw Sergeant Matsumoto share his lunch with Corporal O'Brien when O'Brien was too sick to eat the regular rations. The day before, Yamamoto spent an hour helping repair Private Williams's glasses. These aren't the actions of the inhuman monsters described in your government's propaganda films." That evening, Morrison found himself assigned to help Dr. Chen in the improvised infirmary, a converted storage building where the sickest prisoners received treatment. The work was mundane, holding patients steady while she administered injections, distributing water, adjusting pillows for comfort. What struck him was the presence of Japanese medical personnel working alongside Dr. Chen. Corporal Takeshi, a medic from Yamamoto's unit, shared supplies and techniques with the same professional courtesy Morrison had experienced during rifle discussions. When Private Henderson developed dangerous fever spikes, Takeshi worked through the night to keep him alive. "Why are you helping us?" Morrison asked during a quiet moment. Takeshi's English was limited, but he gestured around the infirmary with the expression Morrison recognized: the universal frustration of medical personnel facing preventable suffering. Sick is sick. War is war. Different things. The next morning brought news that shattered the careful equilibrium Morrison had been building. O'Brien approached him during the morning formation, his face grim. "They're moving prisoners from the other camps. Bad conditions at Cabanatuan. Word is they're starving people there, executing anyone who shows resistance." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "How do you know?" "Filipino network. They get information through." "Morrison, this place, it's not normal. Most camps aren't like this." The revelation hit Morrison like physical force. Everything he'd experienced at O'Donnell, the professional courtesy, the medical attention, the retention of his rifle, represented an anomaly rather than standard Japanese treatment of prisoners. Somewhere else, American soldiers were dying under conditions that matched the propaganda descriptions perfectly. That afternoon, during his session with Yamamoto, Morrison found himself studying the Japanese sniper with new confusion. Here was a man who shared candy, showed family photos, and discussed marksmanship with genuine enthusiasm. Yet he served the same military machine that was systematically brutalizing prisoners at other locations. "Yamamoto-san," Morrison said carefully. "Other camps. Conditions different?" Yamamoto's face darkened, and for a long moment he was silent. Finally he spoke in halting English. "War makes men monsters sometimes, or reveals monsters always there. Here, Commandant believes honor requires treating prisoners with dignity. Not all commandants believe same. The weight of that admission settled over Morrison like the oppressive Philippine heat. He was experiencing an island of humanity in an ocean of systematic cruelty, not because Japanese forces were naturally humane, but because individual choices by individual officers created pockets of decency within a larger system of brutality. Walking back to the barracks that evening, Morrison carried his grandfather's rifle and a new understanding of moral complexity that training had never prepared him for. The enemy had faces now, personal histories, and individual consciences that operated independently of ideology. What happens when you discover that both your worst fears and your unexpected hopes about the enemy are simultaneously true? The secret revealed itself on a humid morning in early February when Morrison discovered Corporal Yamamoto sitting alone in the rifle range, holding a letter written in careful English. The Japanese sniper looked up with an expression Morrison had never seen before. Not the professional courtesy of their technical discussions, but something approaching desperation. "Morrison-san, please, you read English better than me. This letter I need to understand." Morrison accepted the paper with careful hands. The letterhead bore the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps, and the contents made his breath catch. "Corporal Yamamoto, your request for transfer to medical duties has been reviewed and denied. You will continue marksmanship instruction with enemy prisoners per Special Order 47B. Command emphasizes that intelligence gathering regarding American sniper techniques remains the primary objective of these exchanges. Note, prisoner Morrison's rifle represents superior Western optical technology. Detailed examination and documentation of scope mechanisms are required for technical intelligence reports to Tokyo." Morrison read the letter twice before the full implications settled. For weeks, he had believed the daily sessions represented genuine professional exchange between fellow marksmen. Instead, he had been unknowingly providing technical intelligence to enemy forces while they studied his grandfather's rifle for military intelligence purposes. You've been ordered to learn from me, to study my equipment?" Yamamoto's face flushed with shame. "Yes, was orders at first. But Morrison-san, this changed for me. Your rifle, your skill, reminds me why I became marksman. Not for killing, but for precision, for understanding." Morrison felt the betrayal like a physical blow. Every conversation, every technical discussion, every moment of what he had interpreted as mutual respect had been orchestrated as intelligence gathering. Yet as he studied Yamamoto's expression, he saw something that complicated his anger, genuine distress at the deception. The letter mentions medical duties. "You requested transfer 3 weeks ago, after talking with you with Dr. Chen. Cannot continue pretending friendship for intelligence when friendship becomes real." The confession hung between them in the humid air. Around them, the Philippine jungle pressed close to the camp perimeter, filled with bird calls and insect sounds that had become the soundtrack to Morrison's captivity. His M1903A4 leaned against the shooting bench where he had spent hours explaining windage calculations and elevation adjustments to a man who had been ordered to extract that knowledge for enemy use. "Why tell me this? You could have continued the pretense?" Yamamoto pulled out another document, a carbon copy of a report he had filed with camp administration. Morrison's limited Japanese couldn't decipher most of it, but the technical diagrams were clear, detailed sketches of his rifle's scope mounting system, trigger mechanism, and barrel construction. "I filed this report, but Morrison-san, I filled it with incorrect information. Wrong measurements, false specifications. Cannot betray friend, even enemy friend." Morrison stared at the doctored intelligence report, understanding finally dawning. Yamamoto had been sabotaging his own intelligence gathering, filing false technical data to protect the very prisoner he had been ordered to exploit. The risk to himself would be enormous if discovered. They'll find out eventually, when the specifications don't match captured American equipment. Maybe yes, maybe no. War changes many things quickly. Perhaps false information gets lost in, how you say, paperwork. That evening, Morrison sat in the barracks holding his mother's letter and Yamamoto's confession, both documents representing different versions of truth. O'Brien approached, noting Morrison's troubled expression. "Something wrong with your Japanese friend?" Morrison looked up, considering how to explain. How could he describe the complexity of a man ordered to betray him who had instead chosen to risk his own safety? How could he reconcile the systematic intelligence operation with the genuine friendship that had emerged despite its false foundation? "He's not what I thought, Danny. None of this is what I thought." "Meaning what?" Morrison carefully folded both letters and placed them in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. "Meaning the enemy has a conscience. And that might be harder to live with than if he didn't." Outside the barracks windows, the tropical night settled over Camp O'Donnell with its familiar sounds and humid heat. Morrison cleaned his grandfather's rifle with new understanding of its symbolic weight, not just as a weapon or tool, but as a bridge between men who had been taught to see only enemies until small acts of honor revealed they were facing other human beings. And that truth was proving harder to carry than hate had ever been. When friendship emerges from deception, which is more real, the original lie or the genuine connection that grew from it? The liberation of Camp O'Donnell came on March 23, 1942, when American forces broke through Japanese positions along the Bataan Peninsula. Morrison heard the artillery first, distant thunder that grew steadily closer throughout the morning. By afternoon, the familiar whine of P-40 fighters overhead announced the approach of friendly forces. In the chaos of evacuation, Morrison found Corporal Yamamoto loading medical supplies onto a departing truck. The Japanese sniper paused when he saw Morrison approaching with his M1903A4 slung across his shoulder, still in his possession after 2 months of captivity. "Morrison-san, you go home now." "What about you?" Yamamoto's smile carried sadness and relief in equal measure. "I go where orders send me. Perhaps medical duty, perhaps not. War continues." They stood awkwardly for a moment, two marksmen who had found unexpected friendship in the most unlikely circumstances. Finally, Yamamoto reached into his pack and withdrew a small package wrapped in rice paper. "For you, please." Inside, Morrison found a hand-carved wooden figure, a small deer fashioned with the same precision Yamamoto applied to his rifle work. On the base, characters were carved in Japanese alongside English translation. "Respect for the skill, honor for the man." "Yamamoto-san, You keep rifle, Morrison-san. Use for hunting, not war. Make grandfather proud." The Japanese sniper bowed slightly, then climbed onto the truck without looking back. Morrison watched the vehicle disappear down the muddy camp road, carrying away a man he would never see again, but would never forget. 3 days later, Morrison sat in a military hospital in Australia, undergoing debriefing with an intelligence officer who showed particular interest in his technical discussions with enemy personnel. "So, this Japanese sniper, Yamamoto, was gathering intelligence on your equipment?" "That was the initial purpose, yes, sir. But he filed false information to protect American technical advantages." The officer made careful notes. "And you believed this deception was genuine?" Morrison fingered the wooden deer carving in his pocket. "I believed the friendship was genuine, sir. The deception became secondary to that." "Morrison, I need you to understand something. Your testimony about conditions at O'Donnell contradicts reports from other camps. The treatment you describe is not representative of Japanese prisoner policies. You experienced an anomaly." The word hit Morrison like cold water. Anomaly. As if the kindness of Dr. Chen, the respect of Yamamoto, and the basic decency of Sergeant Matsumoto were statistical errors rather than proof that humanity could persist even within systematic brutality. "Yes, sir." I understand. For the purposes of your official record, you were held in a Japanese prisoner camp where you endured harsh conditions but provided no useful intelligence to enemy forces. The details of your personal relationships with camp personnel should remain classified. Understood? Morrison understood perfectly. The complex truth of his experience would be reduced to simple narrative. American prisoner endures Japanese captivity, maintains loyalty, provides no aid to enemy. The fact that enemy soldiers had shown him professional respect, shared food, and ultimately protected him from their own intelligence operations had no place in official history. Understood, sir. The wooden deer rode in Morrison's pocket during the long ship journey home to California, through the train trip to Oklahoma, and finally to the porch of his family home in Tahlequah. His mother's embrace felt different than he remembered, smaller somehow, as if the world itself had shrunk during his absence. Tommy, we heard about the camps, those animals, what they did to our boys. Morrison held his mother close and said nothing about Yamamoto's carved gift, about Matsumoto's shared lunches, or about the Japanese medic who had worked through the night to save American lives. Some truths were too complex for civilian understanding, too dangerous for family peace of mind. That evening, he sat on the back porch cleaning his grandfather's M1903A4 while his father asked careful questions about the war. Morrison found himself describing combat operations, the retreat through Luzon, the technical aspects of jungle warfare, everything except the 2 months that had taught him the most about human nature. That's quite a rifle, son. Your grandfather would be proud. Morrison ran his fingers along the familiar contours of the Weaver scope, remembering Yamamoto's professional appreciation for its precision optics. Yes, sir. It served its purpose. 50 years later, sitting in the same chair on the same porch, Morrison would take the wooden deer from a shoebox of wartime mementos and remember the weight of contradictions he had carried home from the Philippines. His granddaughter would ask about the carving, and he would struggle to explain how an enemy soldier had become a friend, how kindness could emerge from systematic cruelty, and how some truths were too complex for official history. The rifle leaning against the porch rail was the same M1903A4 that had saved 412 Filipino civilians at San Miguel, the same weapon that had earned him professional respect from an enemy sniper, and the same family heirloom that connected him to a grandfather who had taught him to read the wind and measure distances with cold judgment. But Morrison rarely told anyone about the carved deer or about the Japanese corporal who had chosen friendship over orders, honor over intelligence, and conscience over convenience. Some stories were too hard to explain, too nuanced for simple telling. Some truths about war were better preserved in memory than shared with a world that needed enemies to remain enemies, and heroes to stay heroic. In the end, Morrison understood what his grandfather had really meant about reading the wind. It wasn't just about ballistics and bullet drop. It was about understanding that the most important targets were often the assumptions people carried about each other, and sometimes the most difficult shot was choosing not to fire at all. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Can you carry the weight of an enemy's kindness without betraying your own people's pain?